Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Amit Harari, and coming up in today's newscast, the battle for Knesset spots isn't coming to an end as President Isaac Herzog granting Benjamin Netanyahu yet another extension to form the government. The idea of getting ready for every possible scenario in the chilly north. An Israeli professor being lost for words after being confronted with a shocking question on French TV. Prime Minister-designate Benjamin Netanyahu finally getting the extension he desires to properly form his coalition. But that doesn't mean he's out of the woods just yet. ILTV's Aaron Porras with more.
As largely expected he would, Israeli President Isaac Herzog granting an extension to construct a coalition to Prime Minister-elect Benjamin Netanyahu. Though, as opposed to the maximum 14 days possible, Herzog only giving Netanyahu 10 days. So the Likud leader will have until December 21 to finalize agreements between his party and those of his right-wing and religious partners. But in light of concerns over the ideological views of his partners and the appointments thus far reported, Herzog reportedly awarding the 10-day extension with a warning attached. Herzog indicating that Bibi's government, quote, must work for the entire public of Israel, and that it needs to take into account potential damages to Israel's democratic checks and balances, breaches to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, and unity with Jews still overseas in the diaspora. This in light of the coming coalition's determination to pass the so-called override bill, which would sharply limit the High Court of Justice's abilities to block legislation that seems contradictory to Israel's basic laws. In a letter sent to Netanyahu, the president writing, quote, "These are complex times for Israeli society as differences over core issues threaten to stoke violence and blind hatred, and the coalition being formed must maintain a respectful and responsible dialogue between the authorities, executive, legislative, and judicial." Meanwhile, the next biggest challenge actually in finding a new Speaker of the Knesset in order to quickly introduce the override bill for a vote. But already, angry over Netanyahu's giving away of top ministry positions to other parties and apparent newcomers, longtime Likud lawmakers pressuring Bibi from all sides to reward them. In response, Netanyahu said weighing a rotational agreement for the position of foreign minister and for the positions of Knesset Speaker, Justice Minister, and Defense Minister, among others, Netanyahu will likely appoint those who are seen as rising against his leadership in a move to quash rebellion.
Now, who will be the Speaker of the Knesset and how will the Likud finally form a government? Here with us to discuss the latest coalition discussions, meetings, etc. is Executive Director of Honest Reporting and former J-Post political analyst, Gil Hoffman. Gil, good to have you.
Pleasure being with you, Amit.
So the negotiations between Likud and other parties are generally done, and that's all that's left is to appoint Likud lawmakers to the Knesset Speaker position, as well as the Ministries of Justice, Defense, and Foreign Affairs. What are the major difficulties right now?
Well, Netanyahu has made many enemies over his 4 decades in Israeli politics, and over the next 2 weeks, he's going to make a lot more. Because that's what happens when you give out portfolios, when you decide who's going to be the Speaker of the Knesset. Isaac Herzog gave Netanyahu 10 days, but he gave it on a Friday, so he really just left him with a week. After that, Netanyahu, if he says by December 21st that he succeeded in building a coalition, he still can stall for another week, as the Knesset doesn't really have to meet for another week in order to approve the new government. So he will, between now and then, be negotiating with Likud leaders who see themselves being in a much higher position than he can give them. He'll be fighting with them. They'll be doing their own internal protests. It's not going to be pretty.
And why does he need so long? I mean, it was pretty obvious that Netanyahu has a right-wing government. I mean, it was pretty obvious that everything was going to be settled pretty quickly, but it's not the case. I mean, what happened on the way? Obviously, everyone wants something, and he doesn't necessarily want to give it to them, but what kind of makes it stuck, all the positions?
The image of Netanyahu is what has made this take so long. He has an image as a politician who can be extorted politically. And that makes all the different potential coalition partners, even if they're ideologically aligned with him, want to get anything they can out of him until the very last minute. And that's been true of the various coalition partners of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Shas and United Torah Judaism. And now it's going to be true with 20 different Likud ministers. And before that, with the Speaker of the Knesset, which there's already going to have to be a vote on tomorrow in order to proceed with everything else needed to do before the government would be formed. And so it's going to be interesting to see tomorrow. There's even going to be a secret ballot vote in the Likud faction whether Netanyahu will put forth a candidate who can even get a majority when everyone's fighting everybody.
Now, speaking of the Speaker of the Knesset, who are the top candidates?
So I've been seeing the Israeli Hebrew media reporting for days that David Amsalem is the top candidate. I really find it hard to believe because David Amsalem has more enemies than anybody else in Likud. He is an uncouth, challenging person who's not easy to get along with, who Netanyahu can't really trust to be a loyal soldier. So don't be surprised if there ends up being Amir Ohana, who has been mentioned as a possible foreign minister, instead being handed over the job of Knesset Speaker, and the foreign minister becoming Israel Katz, who had that position before. They're all, Danny Danon is running, Yoav Kish is running, but I'm starting to think that Amir Ohana has the outside edge.
Many candidates. Now, there are reports that Netanyahu may create a rotational agreement for the Foreign Affairs Ministry. Like, will Likud lawmakers agree to this? I mean, what are they saying?
It's starting to look like a farce, and Netanyahu doesn't want to look farcical. He already has a rotation agreement in the finance ministry and in the interior ministry and in the health ministry. There's obviously going to be a fight over the foreign ministry. There's more than one Likud leader who wants it, but if he splits it up, he's just going to make enemies out of everybody and not satisfy anyone. It's not easy to be prime minister, and Netanyahu knows that more than anyone in Israel alive today.
Yes, and it's been reported that Netanyahu is choosing rebels for certain positions in order to squash resentment. Will it work?
You can't please all the people all the time, Amit. He might please one or two of the more difficult and challenging people, but that'll create new rebellions later on. And in the outgoing coalition, you had people with very different opinions on key issues, and they respected each other for that. Now, when you have a coalition that's more homogenous, all hell will break loose because everybody's fighting over the same piece of pie.
Gil Hoffman, thank you so much for joining us. Moving on, Haredi Jewish enlistment, or the lack thereof, among the biggest issues dividing Israeli society, but leader of the United Torah Judaism Party, Moshe Gafni, introducing a unique new proposal. Aaron Porras with the details.
On the question of ultra-Orthodox military service, United Torah Judaism chair and likely incoming head of the Knesset Finance Committee, Moshe Gafni, is now coming up with an apparent halfway compromise. Gafni is indicating that he is fine with yeshiva students enlisting into the IDF, so long as non-Haredim in turn study Torah. Gafni explaining that, quote, when there were bloody wars during the reign of King David, a prophet came to him and said that half the people will study Torah and half will serve in the army, and then they'll switch. So I suggest that Ponevez's yeshiva students will go to the army to combat roles, but at the same time bring high school children to study Torah. If that's done, then it's a deal, end quote. The question is then, how serious is this suggestion? Looking into the context of the proposal, some critics are pointing to the Haredi Party's ultimate goal of enshrining Torah study into Israel's basic laws on par with national service. And if recognized as such, all yeshiva students in effect would be exempted from service, because it's unlikely that all secular students would shift their studies to an agreed-upon degree.
The IDF continuing to make sure it's ready for every scenario, and this time a surprise drill in the wintry north with a few thousand soldiers participating. The IDF spokesman announcing Saturday night a surprise exercise improving the readiness of the IDF units in the northern arena. The three-day drill named Warm Winter 2 operating until Tuesday with the purpose of strengthening the readiness of the IDF and its supporting logistical systems for different types of events and various scenarios in the north. 8,000 soldiers and 5,000 reservists being recruited by special orders from the various IDF units, all participating in the drill, as recruitments continue all day today. Although the drill coming as a surprise to the participating troops, the military claiming it was planned in advance, suggesting it was not the result of a novel assessment. The current drill, much alike others in the area in recent months, is indeed to improving the idea of readiness to all sorts of complex situations. This as Hezbollah, Israel's biggest threat on the northern border, having an estimated arsenal of roughly 150,000 rockets and missiles able to reaching any location in Israel. Moreover, according to other estimates, Hezbollah might be joined in a conflict by other Iranian militias with bases in Syria, using missiles and drone strikes. Good luck to the IDF. Now, Israel reportedly sending a sharp message to Beirut over the weekend, threatening even to strike the city's international airport. This as Iran reportedly caught shipping weapons to the Hezbollah terror group aboard civilian flights to Lebanon. Joining to discuss is senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and former Israeli National Security Advisor, Brigadier General Reserves Professor Yaakov Nagel. Hi, Yaakov.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So, what is Hezbollah's threat to Israel as it stands today?
Look, I don't want to affirm or not affirm what Israel passed to Hezbollah or not, but if you remember what I'm saying all the time is that the biggest threat that I see now from Hezbollah, yes, they have 150,000 missiles, but the biggest threat is what we call the PGMs, the precise guided munitions. This part of these missiles, not only missiles, also UAVs and other cruise missiles that are very accurate. And few hundreds or few thousands of them can change the total equation in our northern border. Now, Israel until now, according to foreign press, attacked when one of our three red lines was breached, mostly in Syria and mostly to prevent the transfer of game-changing missiles or part of missiles or technology to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, there are two things that are now happening, and I think that we have to take in a very serious consideration what's going on now in Lebanon. First of all, as was revealed, there are facilities that the Hezbollah is building and sometimes reversing or changing those statistical missiles to an accurate one, and sometimes even building new accurate missiles from scratch. And the second thing is that because they see that Israel, or who is doing it, is stopping the transshipments for those parts to build those missiles from Iran to Lebanon via Syria, they are planning, according to what is published, to send some of those parts using cargo planes or maybe even civilian planes. Israel must pass this message very clear. Now, I'm not an official, of course. Now, I'm not an official now, but I'm saying that we have to make sure that even if it will change the equation and Israel will have to attack on Lebanon soil, it's something that we will have to take into consideration and do it. Otherwise, it will be too late.
Yes, and Yaakov, I'd like to speak to you about what's going on the border these days. In recent weeks, we've seen several major drills, including the surprise Northern Readiness drill over this weekend, and the Israeli-American Air Force exercise simulating an airstrike on Iran. What do you think you will make out of this public show of force? What does Israel make out of it?
It's not a show. It's not a show. The Israeli drills, most of them are pre-planned. Most of them are part of the IDF annual working plan. And some of them are to show that we are doing drills together with US. We did also a drill together with France. The Iranians are continuing to violate every agreement they signed on, and I hope they won't sign on new ones, because the JCPOA is, everyone understands, it's totally outdated and it cannot be reinstituted. Even so, some American officials and others are still trying to find crazy ways to go back to it. So those drills are to show that Israel is preparing itself to defend itself by itself. I hope we will not have to be there alone, and we'll have the Americans and others with us. But if it will come to it, we will have to make sure that we, first of all, dealing with the nuclear program in Iran, but as I mentioned before, dealing with the program of the PGMs in Lebanon and of course in Syria. And if they will move to Lebanon, we'll have to do it in Lebanon also.
And is it enough of a warning to dissuade Tehran and or Hezbollah too?
If there was a warning, and according to the press there was one that Israeli passed, it's a warning that is really due already. I thought it should come much earlier, and it's not only warning. Israel should really do some actions in Lebanon to make sure that the Hezbollah and his allies in Lebanon, and of course in Syria and Iran, will understand that Israel cannot tolerate building of the PGMs in a factory in Lebanon, of course not in a factory in Syria, but again, according to the press, we are doing things in Syria. But they cannot think that Lebanon is immune. I think this is the biggest meaning of this message, if this message was passed to Hezbollah, to Lebanon, and to Tehran. Of course, those drills are sending a message to Tehran that Israel is also combining hands with Americans, Europeans, and maybe others.
Yaakov Nagel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was always a pleasure.
Now, it's 2022 and an Israeli professor being interviewed regularly on French television, suddenly finding himself lost for words while being asked an incredibly unconventional question. Watch this.
An unusual event taking place this week on French television involving the Israeli scientist Professor Cyril Cohen.
Pause.
Oui.
Et elle n'a pas de rapport avec la médecine, mais il y a beaucoup de gens qui me disent pourquoi le professeur porte un insigne religieux sur le plateau.
Je suis d'accord.
Pourquoi? Parce que je la mets tous les jours.
D'accord.
Voilà.
C'est marrant parce que je lui ai fait la même remarque à la machine à café.
Non, mais... Transparence.
Voilà, non,
voilà.
Moi, je la mets tous les jours. Je n'ai pas mise spécialement pour venir chez Pascal Pro. Je peux mettre une casquette, si vous voulez.
Écoutez...
Vous comprenez que,
non, parce que
là, on a une nous, la laïcité, c'est un peu la discrétion, c'est-à-dire, c'est pas du tout anti-religieux, c'est on garde sa religion pour soi. Est-ce que ça, vous l'entendez?
Je m'appelle Cohen. Comment vous voulez que je garde ma religion pour moi? J'y viens d'Israël.
Professor Cohen from Bar-Ilan University is currently staying in Paris while being confronted with this question during a participation in a panel discussing COVID-19 on French TV channel CNews. And then at some point, Cohen feeling the need to end the discussion, asking the panelists if they would be asking the same question to a priest or the Pope to removing their cross or head covering, while deciding to end the discussion by explaining that his head covering is not intending in any way to harm the viewers.
Unbelievable. And now we're honored to have with us head of the immunotherapy lab at Bar-Ilan University, Professor Cyril Cohen himself, experiencing this whole story firsthand. Bonjour Cyril, happy to be speaking to you.
Bonjour Amit, hello.
Bonjour. So Cyril, this video managing to leave so many people around the world absolutely speechless. What was your experience there and how did you feel?
So yeah, basically I was kind of, stunned or surprised. As you mentioned, I've been giving interviews even for ILTV for the past 3 years about COVID, about science, about immunology. And that interview has been going on there in France for 45 minutes. And then suddenly that question that was not related to science, not related to whatever, I was saying about, a COVID wave or whatever. And I felt it was not, I think, the best question to add, because I was kind of surprised a little bit. I felt a little bit uncomfortable at the beginning. But then again, I tried to do my best to answer the concerns of the people asking me those questions.
And you definitely did. So did you get the chance to speak to the anchor, to the panelists after the show? I mean, what did they have to say, to tell you?
Yeah, Yeah, actually, I spoke with the anchor yesterday and 2 days ago, and he apologized for that. He didn't want to put me, on the spot, or he didn't want to ask me. He told me that he was trying to relay the questions he was getting on social media, and I think that he wasn't interested in kind of developing that more than it was by that French Jewish journalist Elisabeth Levy. I think that this is a clash of cultures. In Israel we are kind of open and around the world, but I think that in France there is that question of secularism that is very important, and I think that was more or less a message. But I think it was I would have felt better if this question wasn't asked.
And Cyril, were you aware of the law of not wearing religious pieces, religious items into public places? I mean, you're saying that you were asked a question 45 minutes into the panel, into the interview. So have you heard about it before? Or, I mean, it can be argued whether news is a public place, but have you heard of it before?
No, but you have to make a distinction. That particular law you're referring to is in school, for example, or in a very, I would say, defined environment. Like, for example, if you work in the ministry, in a ministry of something, yes, you might be assigned, or you might have not to display any head covering or religious signs, but that doesn't. I would say it is not, I would say, something that is pertinent to your being in a studio, which is a private venue. So that's, I mean, I never felt, I mean, I gave around 700 interviews on TV. Okay, I was all around the world. In France, I gave like 200 or 300 interviews, and no one has ever asked about my kippah. So yes, I mean, I was aware of that law, but I didn't think it applies to the situation in which I was being asked or whatever.
You were clearly handling the situation very nicely, although it was clear that you were very uncomfortable there. You even managed to confront them, giving a great example of a priest or a pope. And Cyril, as a Jewish man wearing a kippah, have you experienced more remarks like this before?
No, actually, no. I mean, I'm not talking about anti-Semitism. I don't think that what happened there is anti-Semitism at all. It's not, to my, I would say, because of my personal relationship with the anchor, etc. I don't think it is. I know it's not anti-Semitism, because on the same channel a year ago, I was actually, the anchor wished me happy Hanukkah. But in terms of anti-Semitism, I did experience that in France when I was younger. I left France 30 years ago. And sometimes, people might look at whatever sign you have on your head, like, something that identify yourself as something. But no, I never had that kind, especially on live, live TV. I never had that kind of experience. It was interesting, but as you understood, I'm Jewish. I'm proud of being Jewish, proud of being Israeli. So, I'm here. I stand for my beliefs and what I am, and that's nothing more.
Cyril, thank you so much for joining us, and happy Hanukkah soon.
Happy Hanukkah. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you. Now, some good news coming from Germany, just a few days passing since news breaking out about a far-right coup planning to overthrow the German government, and now government officials approving Germany's first ever program specifically designed to fighting anti-Semitism and promoting Jewish life. The national strategy against anti-Semitism and for Jewish life being approved by the entire German cabinet at the end of the week and presented in Berlin by Felix Klein, Germany's anti-Semitism commissioner, highlighting the best practices and recommending new political and societal actions. The new German government strategy outlining 5 areas of focused data gathering, research and accurate assessment of anti-Semitism, education as a preventative measure, novel approaches to Holocaust remembrance, enhancing security, and making both present-day and historical Jewish life in Germany visible. The new strategy is in response to the European Union's call to the action from 2021, encouraging member states to submit national anti-Semitic prevention plans by the end of 2022. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight you're going to expect cloudy skies and cooler temperatures with an average low of about 11 degrees Celsius or 51 Fahrenheit. And then tomorrow seeing cloudy skies overhead and an average high of 23 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channels on YouTube, Facebook, and Telegram, and subscribe to our ILTV newsletter. I'm Amita Haredi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.